Okay, hi guys and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I thought I would do something a little bit different by going into the cultural differences that I've experienced living in Europe for the past 3 years versus what I experienced when I was living in the United States. For context, I moved to Norway 3 years ago on a study visa. I lived here for that entire time, completing my master's degree at the University of Oslo and graduated last year. Last year, after I graduated, I was lucky enough to find myself a permanent job here in the city and decided at that point that I wanted to keep living in Europe permanently. After being here for around 3 years, I slowly but surely got accustomed to life in Europe and in Norway. Of course, there was always going to be things that I missed about the US, and I always felt a little bit homesick anytime I thought about home. This summer though, I was actually lucky enough to go and visit the US for the first time in a couple years. While I was there visiting my family in the US, all of a sudden these memories started to come flooding back to me about what it was like to be living in America and all the things I missed about the country. Being there, I felt really inspired and actually got the idea to make this video. So today I'm going to be talking about everything that I miss about being home in the US and some of the reasons why I decided to leave it all behind and move to Norway. Yeah, let's get into it. Now, this may come as a shock to you, but the price of living in the United States is actually more expensive than the price of living in Norway. Just to give you an idea, the average cost of living for a single person in Norway is $1,964, while in the US it's $2,317 for a single person household. The average cost of living for families in Norway, on the other hand, is $4,408, while in the US it's $5,291 for families. Now, after doing some research, it looks like this disparity is mainly attributed to the rent prices in the United States, which for a single person household is $400 more expensive than Norway, or for a family is $700 more expensive than in Norway. While rent may be more expensive in the United States, all of the other goods and services are more expensive in Norway, so things like transportation, food, and other public services. On top of all of this, Americans with similar jobs to their Norwegian counterparts earn higher salaries than those Norwegian counterparts, which essentially means that a lot of this cost of living disparity can be evened out at the end of the day. But then again, that's just when you're looking at the middle and upper middle class. Where this really starts to become an issue is when you start looking at the lower classes and people below the poverty line. Take minimum wage, for example. The United States' minimum wage has not been changed since 2009 and is still at $7.25 an hour. Now, when you compare this to Norway's minimum wage, that was updated in June of 2023 and is currently $16.50 an hour for minimum wage jobs and services like retail or the food industry. When you put things into this kind of perspective, you really see the staggering difference between the people earning minimum wage in America and the people earning minimum wage in Norway. Norway's minimum wage employees are earning over double what Americans are. And that's before even factoring in things like free education, free healthcare, and paid time off. All things that a minimum wage employee in America can only dream of. And while this might not affect the middle and upper middle classes very much, just think about it this way. I think the person in America earning $7.25 an hour in a minimum wage job is going to struggle a lot more to make their rent than the equivalent Norwegian person. Almost everyone I know in the US who works minimum wage jobs either lives with a ton of roommates, needs 2 to 3 jobs just to get by, or still lives at home. This really isn't sustainable or a way to survive in the long term. Norway, on the other hand, the minimum wage is exactly that, the minimum salary that someone needs to provide for themselves for things like housing and food. But hey, there's no denying that the US still has way better consumer options than in Norway. I mean, Trader Joe's alone probably has more options than every single supermarket in Norway combined, which makes a lot of sense since Norway has to import most of their food products, which is also why they're more expensive. In other words, that just means whenever I'm visiting the US, I have to stock up on all of my yummy snacks. So, as I touched on before, I originally immigrated to Norway for studies. Specifically, I came here to finish my master's degree. Now, funny enough, when I first moved to Norway back in 2021, tuition was free for everyone: Norwegians, Europeans, and those who come from outside of the EU. Unfortunately, that is no longer the case. Last year, in 2022, the Norwegian Parliament made the decision to introduce this new tuition fee for students coming from outside of the European Economic Zone or Switzerland, which essentially means that higher education is no longer free for people who come from places outside of the EU, like the United States. So me, myself, I wouldn't have the same opportunities that I originally had when I came here in 2021. I would now be part of that group that had to pay a hefty tuition fee in order to study in higher institutions in Norway. Now, it's kind of hard to put the blame solely on the Norwegian parliament here. In fact, Norway was one of the only countries left in the world that still offered this free higher education for everyone, including international students. So the fact that they're removing this now is unfortunately just a trend of the times. They're following in the steps of other countries. It's kind of depressing to see, but that's kind of the way education has been trending for a while now, when it comes to international education, that is. But if you think about it, the education here is still free for Norwegian citizens and anyone from the European Economic Zone. It's actually crazy when I think about it. When I was studying at the University of Oslo, my tuition fees were only about $50 a semester, which is insane. When you compare that to the United States' prices, a state university in the US averages around $26,000 a year. When you think about it in that aspect, there's no comparison. Education is just so much more economically accessible for people in Norway than for people in the US. Now, how could I talk about these drastic price differences in public services without touching on healthcare? Now, I'm sure you've all heard the horror stories about the healthcare and insurance situation in the United States. Now, I'm not saying it's perfect in Norway either, but just to put things into perspective, in the United States, your monthly insurance bill can cost anywhere between $300 to $500 a month. And even after paying that monthly fee for your entire life, if you do need to have your medical expenses covered, you still need to pay thousands of dollars to the hospital before the insurance will even consider starting to help you pay. Now, let's compare this to the Norwegian healthcare system, which, for the record, is by no means perfect. There's often very long waiting lines at all urgent care centers, and being able to find yourself a general practitioner can be a real struggle. You're often put on a wait list for upwards of 1 year just to get a regular doctor. But if you want to forego some of these issues, you can always turn towards the private healthcare sector, which does exist in Norway. And then that also comes with its own expensive problems, similar to the United States situation. But just to shed some light on some of the economic prices of healthcare here, from my personal experience, anytime I've gone to go see my general practitioner, it only cost me around $20 each time I visited him, and I'm not paying any kind of healthcare insurance. This is just provided by the state. And the one time I did have to go see a specialist, that only cost me $50. I'm not exactly sure what you're going to be paying in the US for a specialist, but my guess is more than that, and that's only if you have insurance. Now, of course, the reason why Norway has such drastically different prices when it comes to education and healthcare is because these services are helped out by the taxation system in Norway. I'm always going to be investing into these services, but at the end of the day, I think it's still worth it. Whether it's education or going to the hospital, everyone in the society will benefit from having these services. I really think it's a good investment, not only for our individual futures, but for the future of the society as a whole. So I'll admit it, I'm rather new to the workforce in Norway. The job I'm currently in here, I've only had for almost a year now, but during the past couple of months, I have in fact noticed quite a few differences between what it's like being an employee in the US versus what it's like being an employee in Norway. Essentially, my work life looks something like this. My office is a hybrid office, which first of all means that I'm allowed to work from home 2 days a week, which is a great perk to have. But on the days that I do go to the office, I try to be there around 8 in the morning. One of the biggest differences that I noticed right away was that our work days are only 7.5 hours long, or 37.5 hours a week, which means if I'm at the office by 8 a.m., I'm leaving the office by 4. Because of the great public transportation systems in Norway, I'm able to take the train to and from the office, which is only a 20-minute train ride. This is contrasted with the intense rush hour traffic that I always see when people are driving their cars on the freeway. So having this public transportation option that is reliable, quick, and easy it's priceless, really. It really revolutionizes your life and your ability to go wherever you want to go, even if you don't have a car. On top of all of this, I also get a ton of benefits with working in Norway, such as the 21 paid vacation days, 16 paid sick days, long-term sick leave that is paid for by the government, paternity leave and maternity leave, and this thing called flexi time, which is essentially if you work a little bit of overtime, that means you can leave early the next day, and it really helps you a lot. But another way you can use this flexi time system is if you have a family, you can leave the office early every single day, go have family time with your kids, and then log back on later in the evening and finish up the workday then. It's really flexible, and there's a big focus on the work-life balance, and the values of time off and family are essential to being an employee in Norway. This is such a different work culture. Everybody really values their family time, vacation days, and not overworking themselves. Now, this is very different from my experience working in America. America has very different values when it comes to the employer-employee relationship. Hard work and perseverance are some of the founding core values of American work society. Going through the grind is just expected to be one of those stepping stones that everybody goes through when reaching the American dream. And there is a grain of truth to this. The salaries are in fact higher in the US than in Norway when you look at similarly compared jobs like being a lawyer or being a doctor. There's a lot more job listings and job opportunities in America as a whole because it is a bigger country. But I think this obsession over work has seeped into almost every aspect of our society in America. Whenever I'm talking to my friends back home, talk about work is one of the main things that we discuss in our social circles. It's just so competitive and it takes up so much of our life. It is obvious why it's the main thing that we talk about. But I think this has been raised to people's awareness, how it can be problematic. There has been a big focus on burnout and the high stressful nature of these kind of American workplaces. People are working to the brink of their sanity essentially sometimes, and it's really not good for your mental health. There is this kind of pressure to overwork yourself, stick to the grind, not take your vacation days, do whatever you have to get ahead in this high competitive work environment. And it's easy to see why a lot of people snap from this. So I can definitely see why there's certain people that thrive in this environment, but on the other hand, I don't think I'm one of those people. I personally value this more laid-back work environment where there's not a big focus on competition and there's a much bigger focus on the balance between your personal life and your working life. I guess it really just depends on what you value and how you want your career to look in the future. Now, there's no denying that Norway and the United States have some of the most beautiful natural landscapes on Earth, whether it be the Grand Canyon in Arizona or the gorgeous northern lights in the Arctic Circle in Norway. Both countries essentially have something for every nature enthusiast, but there is something specific nature-wise that I wanted to touch on here. In Norway, we have this law called Allmennsretten, or every man's right. Essentially, what this law is it says that every person in Norway, whether they're a visitor, a citizen, or anyone really, has the right to freely explore and experience nature. The way this manifests itself is that the concept of state or federally owned and operated national parks doesn't really exist in Norway. If I want to climb a mountain, go for a hike in the forest, go swimming in a fjord, or set up camp somewhere, that is my right. There's no entry fees, permits, or registrations required, and this is a very important cultural aspect of Norway as well. Nature is an incredibly important part of the Norwegian identity, and being able to access that nature free of charge anytime, anywhere is equally as important for the people. Directly contrasting this, you have the US federally and nationally owned national parks. While the nature itself is equally as beautiful as the nature in Norway, the experience is really different because of the monetization of nature in the US. This summer when I was in the US, we visited Olympic National Park. The nature itself was absolutely gorgeous, but our experiences were somewhat dampened by the fact that we had to wait in hour-long lines to go on hikes, had to pay multiple registration and permit fees at different entry points of the park, and were even denied access at one point to Hurricane Ridge because of capacity issues. We also went camping this summer, which was a completely different experience to camping in Norway. In Norway, when I want to go camping, I simply get my gear in my backpack, walk out into the wilderness, and find a spot that looks beautiful to set up camp for the night. In the United States, however, the process is very different. When we were visiting the US, we wanted to go camping in one of the national parks, so I found myself having to register for a camping spot 6 months in advance and pay a fee in order to hold the spot for our camping trip. I started to notice that when you have to do all of this months in advance planning, registrations, paying permit fees, and waiting in these long lines, it really limits the access that the public has to nature in America. Both countries are filled with beautiful nature. It's just a shame that in the US, accessing that beauty comes with a price. Now, Norway is one of those European countries where everybody speaks English fluently. For me, that is pretty much perfect because I'm from America and English is my first language. But it does come with its own hidden challenges that you wouldn't necessarily think of upon first glance. Because everyone is fluent in English, as soon as they detect my American accent, they instantly switch languages from speaking Norwegian to speaking English, which was fine in the beginning because I was still learning Norwegian, but after a couple of years, it's made practicing in public rather difficult. If I can't go out into public and talk to a waitress or a shopkeeper in Norwegian, then where am I going to practice? On top of all of this, Norway is filled with different dialects, which is a beautiful thing for a language to have, but it also makes it really hard to learn when you're learning this as a second language. For example, someone from the north of Norway is going to sound like they're speaking a completely different language than someone from the south. For a native speaker, this is no issue. They can all understand each other fluently, but as an outsider, it is kind of like trying to learn 5 languages in one. I've slowly come to realize that because this is my second language, I'll never truly be able to fully express myself in it, which is kind of sad and is one of the main things I miss about living in the US, just how easy it was to communicate and express myself with everyone around me. But when I think about it, this is probably an experience that a lot of people have when immigrating to a new country that speaks a different language than them. Now, when I compare this to the US though, it makes what the US has language-wise truly incredible. 331 million people all speaking the same language and able to understand each other. I mean, sure, we have different accents, but we can still understand everyone. Like, if I'm listening to somebody from California versus Texas versus Florida, I can understand everybody easily. And while the diversity of language and dialects in Europe and Norway is a beautiful thing, I will always miss being able to be easily understood by those around me. Now, it might not necessarily look like it at first, but the United States is full of many different cultures. I truly believe that the US is the very definition of a melting pot. The result of this melting pot society has been a country full of different cultures, traditions, accents, and lifestyles. Someone from the deep south in the US will have grown up with completely different cuisine and weekend traditions than someone from the Pacific Northwest, for example. When we're comparing diversity in cultures, I think it's better if we compare the entirety of the US to the entirety of Europe. Every country in Europe has its own cuisines, languages, history, cultures, traditions. Where the main differences lie, though, is in how we identify ourselves. Americans are all very different, but we share a lot of commonalities. We have similar cuisines, national holidays, history, language, all things that help us identify as Americans. Whereas the different countries in Europe are exactly that, they're different countries, so of course they're going to identify differently. The diversities of cultures in such a very concentrated geographical area is amazing in Europe, and it's one of the main reasons why I love living here and getting to travel and experience all these different places. But then again, it comes with some of its drawbacks. When you're in America, you have this entire vast country where essentially anywhere you go, yeah, there's going to be a slightly different microculture there, but you can fit in everywhere. Whereas in Europe, it's kind of the opposite. Everybody is embracing their differences, their different histories, their different cultures. Everything is so much more different. But a part of me does miss being able to travel hundreds of miles away and still being able to relate to someone the same way you can when you're crossing the different coasts of the United States. Thankfully, I love traveling and experiencing new cultures and meeting new people, so this is a challenge that I will happily take on. I think in conclusion, it's pretty obvious my reasons for moving to Norway permanently. I personally really value the ability to travel across Europe, all of the time off that comes from the great work-life balance here in the working system, and all of the extra security that comes from these built-in social and welfare services. Of course, everything comes with a trade-off, and there's a lot I'm giving up by choosing to live in Norway. Things like a sense of instant belonging with my fellow citizens, the endless consumeristic choices from capitalism, and the higher salaries that are often paid in the US. At the end of the day though, I still feel confident in my decision and that I did what was best for me. But what's best for me isn't necessarily applicable to everybody. I think you really just have to take a look at yourself and decide what is going to make you happiest at the end of the day. But anyways, thanks so much for joining me on this very long and rambling list of comparisons between my experiences in Norway and my experiences being from the US. If you like this video, make sure to give it a big thumbs up and subscribe down below, and check out some of my other videos about what it's like living in Norway as an American. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Bye guys!